The dust of the open plains carried whispers that traveled farther than wagons, farther than the clop of horseshoes, farther than the crack of a rifle shot. Folks out west always said the land had a memory of its own, that every heartbreak, every betrayal, and every triumph got woven into the wind that scraped over the hills. And if that were true, then this ranch, this broken-down patch of dirt that once stood as the butt of every joke in town, remembered her sorrow better than anyone. She had been mocked, ridiculed, and abandoned, left to shoulder the weight of ruin that wasn't hers to bear. Her ex-husband had called it a lost cause, laughed at her dream, and rode away certain she'd never survive without him. But the West had a way of shaping those it tested hardest. And now, the same land that had once seen her cry had made her untouchable. It hadn't always been that way. Years back, when she first arrived at the ranch as a bride, her heart had been brimming with hope. She pictured warm fires through the winters, wheat that swayed high as her waist, cattle thick on the hillsides, and a man by her side who believed in her as much as she believed in him. What she got instead was a husband who underestimated the grit it took to wrestle life out of stubborn soil. He saw her as a decoration, something to place beside him at church gatherings, but never a partner to trust with the ranch. When the well dried up one summer and the cattle starved the next, his pride shriveled faster than the corn stalks in the fields. He blamed her for dreams that slipped through his fingers. And then one morning, without a word of warning, he was gone. She was left with nothing but debt, cracked fences, and a leaking roof that sagged like a tired back. The neighbors whispered behind their hands. She heard the snickers at the mercantile, the sharp words dropped in the saloon. That poor woman. She'll lose it all before the year is out. Even her ex-husband, from miles away, made it known that he thought she was a fool for staying behind. His letters carried sneers, mocking the ruin he was sure she would never escape. And for a while, she almost believed it. Nights spent sitting by the cold stove, staring at the ledger that screamed more red than black, she thought about giving in. But giving in wasn't the way she was made, the land taught her. Hard lessons, cruel lessons, but lessons nonetheless. She learned how to set her jaw against the wind and keep moving, how to ride harder and longer than men twice her size, how to mend fences with blistered hands that once knew only sewing needles. She traded sleep for sweat, hunger for hope, and slowly the ranch began to answer back. The soil gave when she treated it right, the cattle fattened when she watched them like kin, and the wide West, with all its merciless trials, carved out a strength in her that no mockery could break. Years passed. What was once broken became something wilder, richer, and more alive than anyone could have guessed. She struck deals where others hesitated, claimed water rights that men had overlooked, brought in new horses that carried the kind of fire people traveled counties to see. The ranch became a name folks spoke with respect, though many spoke it with envy too. She built it with grit, with stubbornness, with the very pain that had once nearly crushed her. And in time, her sorrow turned into a crown no one could take, but the West had a way of circling back. Nothing ever stayed buried for long, not in towns where rumors spread quicker than prairie fire. It was on a warm afternoon, when the sky stretched endless and the sound of cattle drifted low across the land, that word came. He was returning. The man who once mocked her, who left her with nothing but a wreck of a ranch, was riding back into town. Some said he had failed in the places he thought were brighter. Others said he was looking to reclaim what he had abandoned. Whatever the truth, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the land had remembered, and so had she. When she heard the news, she didn't tremble, didn't flinch, didn't let her hands falter on the reins. But deep in her chest, a fire stirred. This was no longer the woman he had known, no longer the wife he had left behind in a cloud of dust. This was a woman the land itself had forged into steel. He would find the ranch not broken, not empty, but alive in ways he never imagined. He would find her not desperate, but dangerous. And perhaps the cruelest thing of all, for him he would find her utterly beyond his reach. The townsfolk buzzed with talk, eager for the reunion. They wondered if she'd take him back, if old flames still burned, if the sight of him would soften her heart. But they didn't know her heart had been buried out there in the dirt long ago. What had grown in its place was something untouchable. She wasn't waiting for him. She wasn't waiting for anyone. The ranch was hers now, every stone, every fence post, every acre that stretched beneath the wide western sky. The day he rode in, dust trailing behind his horse, heads turned in the street, he looked older, worn down by choices that hadn't favored him. His eyes scanned the land he had once laughed at, and already it was plain he didn't recognize it anymore. The broken fences had been rebuilt stronger than before. The sagging roof now gleamed under the sun. The fields were thick with promise, and the sound of livestock rolled like thunder. But most of all, it was her he didn't recognize, the way she sat tall in the saddle. Calm, sure, commanding, as if she owned not just the ranch, but the very horizon itself. For a moment, the town held its breath, waiting to see how she would greet him. Would she spit venom, or offer forgiveness, or perhaps let silence speak louder than words? The air thickened with tension as their eyes met. Two lives colliding after years apart. He shifted in his saddle, uneasy, as if he already sensed the balance of power had shifted in ways he could never undo. And then, with the weight of the land itself behind her, she nudged her horse forward, closing the space between them. What she would say, how she would choose to meet him, was not yet clear. But one thing was certain: he had returned expecting a broken woman, forgotten ranch, a chance to reclaim what he had lost. Instead, he had come face to face with something far more dangerous. The woman he once mocked was richer, wilder, and utterly beyond his grasp. And whatever happened next would change not only his fate, but the story of the land itself. The street was silent, except for the squeak of leather saddles and the faint clink of spurs. People gathered in small knots along the boardwalk, their whispers too low to carry, though everyone's eyes stayed fixed on the two riders facing each other. She sat tall, her gloved hands steady on the reins, her horse shifting with quiet patience. He, on the other hand, looked restless, like a man realizing the land he thought he knew had turned strange and foreign in his absence. The last time he had seen her, she had been worn thin by struggle, her clothes plain, her eyes heavy with doubt. Now she looked every inch a ranch owner, a woman in command of herself and her world. He cleared his throat. But whatever words he thought would come did not find him quickly. She waited, expression calm, as if his arrival meant nothing at all. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Anger he could have met head-on, but indifference cut deeper because it told him he no longer mattered. He tried to mask it, but the years had carved into his face. The lines of disappointment were etched too deep, his once confident jaw worn by choices that hadn't turned out as he planned. He thought leaving her in the ranch had freed him. The wider world would give him more than dusty fences and struggling cattle. But out there he had only found men sharper than him, opportunities that slipped through his grasp, and doors that closed faster than he could knock. He had thought himself clever, but clever didn't survive long in a world that chewed men whole. Now, with pride scuffed raw, he had returned to the place he once scorned, hoping perhaps it had stayed as broken as when he left. Only it hadn't. The ranch had grown into something he could hardly believe. He had heard whispers even before he returned, rumors of her horses fetching fine prices, for cattle thriving, for land stretching richer each year. He had told himself it was talk, gossip born from nothing. But as he rode past her pastures that morning, he knew it wasn't talk. It was real. She had done what he never could. The onlookers grew restless, shifting as if waiting for fireworks. But she didn't offer them any. She only gave a slight tilt of her head, quiet acknowledgement that reminded everyone watching that the story unfolding wasn't theirs to claim. With a gentle pull on her reins, she turned her horse toward the ranch and rode off without a word. He was left in the middle of the street, the dust rising around him, heat pressing down heavy, and every eye in town knowing she had bested him without even speaking. That night, the saloon filled with talk. Some said she was cold as ice. Others said she had every right to be. Men who once mocked her now leaned in close, recounting tales of how she had turned the ranch around. How she worked sunup to sundown, how she outbid seasoned ranchers at auctions and never flinched. Women who once pitied her now whispered admiration, though some sharpened it with envy. And he sat in the corner, glass in hand, listening to stories about her that sounded like legends. each one a reminder that the woman he had abandoned had risen higher than he ever dreamed. But the past is never content to stay buried, and though the ranch thrived, shadows still stretched across its history. She remembered too well the hunger in those early winters, the nights patching fences by lantern light, the mornings spent selling trinkets in town just to keep the cattle fed. Those scars never faded, no matter how green the fields looked now. And with his return, those scars threatened to split open again. The truth was, the ranch's success had not come without sacrifice. Deals had been struck that cost her more than coin. Alliances formed with men whose loyalty bent only as far as profit. There were whispers of land disputes, old grudges over water rights, neighbors who didn't forgive her sudden rise to power. She had learned to stand firm, to look danger in the eye, but even now she knew the West was never kind for long. One wrong step, one misplaced trust, and everything could crumble. As he lingered in town, he began asking questions. Folks noticed it right away. He wanted to know how many head of cattle she kept now, who she hired to work her land, where she traded her horses, how she managed to grow crops on soil everyone else had given up on. He cloaked it in casual talk, but everyone knew better. He wasn't just curious. He was studying, measuring, trying to find a way back in. She, too, felt his presence like a storm gathering on the horizon. It wasn't fear that unsettled her, but memory. He had once known the shape of her laughter, the sound of her footsteps in the hall, the way her dreams had filled their evenings by the fire. To see him again was to see a ghost wearing flesh. But she would not allow the past to dictate her future. He had chosen to mock her when she was weakest, to walk away when she needed him most. That choice carved a canyon between them, one that no return could bridge. Still, the land had its own way of drawing lines. The ranch stood on soil that held secrets. The creek at the edge of her property, the one that now kept her cattle fat, had been the source of long disputes among ranchers. More than one man in town claimed rights to it. His return stirred up whispers that he might try to stake a claim as her ex-husband. The law in the West was never clear-cut, and papers carried less weight than the strength of one's back and the sharpness of one's resolve. If he meant to challenge her, it would not be in court but in grit, in presence. In power, she spent her nights walking the ranch, lanterns swinging at her side, listening to the creak of wind through the barn and the steady breath of horses in their stalls. Each sound reminded her of what she had built, what she stood to lose. But it also reminded her of who she had become. This was no longer the dream of a wide-eyed bride. This was her kingdom carved from dust and hardship, and she would not surrender it. The days grew heavier as the tension thickened. He rode near her land often, sometimes too close to be mistaken for coincidence. Workers reported seeing him pause on the ridge, watching the fields, studying the cattle. Once, one of her hands found him near the south fence, claiming he had lost his way. She didn't believe it. He was measuring her strength, looking for weakness, just as he had once measured her heart. But what he didn't understand was that the ranch had forged her into something different. Weakness had long ago burned away. Word spread that he was trying to gather allies, reaching out to old acquaintances, making offers in hushed tones. Some ranchers listened, tempted by the idea of cutting down the woman who had risen so high. Others kept their distance, wary of crossing her. She heard every whisper, every half-truth, every rumor. And though her face never showed it, inside she weighed each one carefully. Out here, power wasn't just about land or cattle, it was about respect. And respect could vanish faster than rain on dry soil, one evening. As the sun dipped low and the sky bled gold and crimson, she stood on the porch of her ranch house and looked out at the horizon. She knew he was out there somewhere, plotting, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But she also knew that whatever came, she would meet it head-on. She was no longer the woman he had left behind. The land had seen her break, then watched her rise. And now it whispered a truth she carried in her bones. The past had returned to test her. The question that hung in the air, heavier than storm clouds, was whether he had come to reclaim what he thought was his, or to destroy what he could not control. Either way, the clash between them was inevitable, and the West itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the sparks to ignite, The morning he finally crossed her fence line. The sky was heavy with low clouds, pressing down on the valley like a weight. She had risen before dawn, as always, to walk the ranch and check on the livestock. The cattle were restless, their movements stirring the dust, and even the horses seemed uneasy, tossing their heads as if they sensed the storm that had nothing to do with the weather. She knew before she saw him that he had come. The air carried it, sharp and unsettled, the way the land sometimes warned of trouble before it appeared. He rode in slow, as if he belonged there, his horse stepping carefully over ground that was no longer his. She watched from the barnyard gate, her hand resting lightly on the worn wood, eyes steady. He dismounted with the ease of a man who wanted to remind her he hadn't forgotten how to move across this land. But when his boots hit the dirt, the sound was hollow, like footsteps echoing in a place that no longer welcomed him. "You've done well for yourself," he said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. It was a simple line, but behind it lay pride, bitterness, and something else she couldn't quite name. She didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch until he shifted under its weight. "Finally," she said, "better than you expected." The words hit harder than a slap, and though his face stayed even, his jaw tightened. He walked closer, looking around at the corral, the new fencing, the barns rebuilt stronger than before. Every detail mocked his earlier scorn. She could see it in the way his eyes flicked across the land, trying to reconcile the ruin he left behind with the thriving ranch standing before him. But it wasn't just her ranch that drew him back. Whispers had reached her. He was broke, deep in debt, chasing after what he thought he could claim by blood or by law. And some in town said he was working to stir up old disputes about the creek. She could almost taste the danger of it. Out here, water was worth more than gold. If he meant to tangle her success with his claims, the fight wouldn't stay clean. Still, this wasn't a matter for land deeds alone. There was something personal in his return, something raw. Perhaps it was the sting of failure, the humiliation of seeing her triumph where he had once laughed. Or perhaps it was the simple truth that he had underestimated her. And now he couldn't bear the weight of that mistake. Her ranch hands watched from a distance, her tools resting idle in their palms. They didn't interfere, but their presence was strong, a quiet wall of loyalty that she had earned with years of sweat beside them. He noticed it too, and she caught the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He had never commanded that kind of respect, not even when the land had still been his. That evening, as the sun sank low and the air cooled, she sat with her foreman on the porch. He was a steady man, loyal, one who had been with her since the early days when the ranch teetered on collapse. "He'll test you," the foreman said. "Not just on paper. He'll look for cracks anywhere he can." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Let him look," she answered. "He won't find what he's hoping for." Yet she couldn't ignore the way the town leaned toward the spectacle of it all. Some sided with her, proud to see a woman succeed where many men had failed. Others whispered that her rise had come too fast, that no one could climb so high without secrets buried in the dirt. And with him stirring the pot, those whispers grew louder. In the saloon, men debated who held true claim to the creek. Whether she had overstepped by securing rights that once belonged to others, and though no one dared say it outright, there was a dangerous undercurrent that her strength had made her enemies as much as it had made her. Admired, the conflict grew sharper when he began riding into town with allies at his side. A pair of ranchers who had long resented her success now listened closely to his words. They had lost cattle to drought, fields to dust, and they didn't like seeing her land flourish while theirs withered. He told them she had taken more than her fair share, that her ranch's growth came at the cost of others. Whether they fully believed it or not, it was enough to set a fire burning. At the same time, smaller troubles began to stir closer to home. A section of her north fence was cut one night, the posts hacked through as though by a sharp axe. A few of her cattle wandered onto neighboring land, and though she mended the damage quickly, the message was clear. Another night, the water troughs were fouled with mud, horses spooked into a frenzy that left one lame for days. She said nothing in town about it, but her hands knew, and their loyalty grew even fiercer as they rallied to protect what was theirs. All the while, He played the part of the returned husband, speaking with a tone that mixed familiarity and challenge. "This was once mine," he said one afternoon, standing near the creek as though the water itself might remember his claim. "And it could be again." She met his gaze without flinching. "It was never yours," she replied. "It belonged to the land, and the land never chose you." Those words seemed to linger in the air, heavy as storm clouds. The conflict was no longer just about property or pride. It had become a battle of wills, a test of who the land itself would answer to. And though she had proven herself, he would not stop until he forced the world to acknowledge him, too. As the days passed, she began to sense the strain not only on her ranch, but on the community around it. Old grudges stirred, old rivalries sharpened. The town's sheriff, a man who preferred peace to conflict, tried to keep the disputes contained. But even he admitted the West had a way of spilling blood when men felt cornered. Yet beneath the weight of it all, a quieter thread pulled at her thoughts. There had been a time when she had loved him, when his voice had carried her through long nights, when his presence had been her comfort. That memory clashed hard with the man now standing against her, bitter and restless. Sometimes late at night, when the ranch fell silent, she wondered if he saw those memories too, if he regretted what he had thrown away. But regret, if it lived in him, came twisted, and it didn't soften his edge. It only made him more dangerous. The subplots tangled tighter. Her youngest ranch hand, barely more than a boy, confessed he'd overheard talk of a scheme to challenge her legally using the fact that she had once been married to him. The laws weren't always clear, but even the hint of such a claim could tie her up in court. Drain her money, distract her from the work. At the same time, a neighboring rancher's daughter, bright, eager, sharp, dashed to learn under her, saying she wanted to know how a woman could command land the way she did. It was a request that carried hope, but also risk. For bringing someone new into her fold meant opening another door when enemies were already trying to break through. Through it all, the ranch remained her anchor. The creak of saddles, the dust of the trails, the smell of hay and horse sweat and leather, all of it reminded her of why she fought. She didn't just fight for herself, but for the land that had nearly killed her and then given her strength, for the people who worked beside her, for the proof that she could not be mocked or broken again. Yet every step forward seemed to draw the conflict tighter. Like a rope pulled to breaking, he was circling closer, allies gathering in his shadow, whispers turning sharper in town. And she knew, as surely as she knew the shape of the hills around her, that the clash between them was coming. The land would not hold them both in peace. The question was not if, but how and whether the fire they were building would consume only them, or spread across every corner of the valley. The storm began not with thunder, but with whispers that spread faster than wind. By late summer, the town was alive with talk of claims, rights, and justice. He had been careful, choosing his words in ways that seemed harmless on the surface, but carried sharp edges underneath. At the saloon, he told ranchers their herds had thinned because her ranch had stolen water. At the mercantile, he suggested her success was bought through underhanded dealings. And in hushed corners, he promised that the lift anyone cared to stir it awake would prove that, as her ex-husband, he still had a say in the land she now commanded. Each word dropped like a stone in water, rippling wider with every retelling. She felt the tension as clearly as the dry heat on her skin. The ranch hands grew more guarded, their eyes sweeping the ridges when they rode out. Rifles kept closer than before. The cattle grew restless too, unsettled by the scent of unease in the air. Even the horses seemed to carry the weight of what was coming. She moved among them, steady as ever, but inside her chest, the fire burned hotter each day. He wasn't only threatening her land, he was threatening everything she had built, everything she had bled for. Then came the night when the barn nearly burned. Flames licked high against the dark sky, crackling with hunger as smoke poured into the stars. It was her foreman who spotted it first, shouting the alarm. Buckets flew, hands worked until their arms trembled, and together they beat the fire back before it swallowed the ranch whole. When dawn broke, the barn stood blackened but standing, the smell of charred wood clinging to the air. She knew it hadn't been an accident. Fire didn't start itself on a windless night. And though she had no proof, Every part of her believed it was his doing, or at least his influence. The attack hardened her resolve, but it also deepened the divide in town. Some said she was being targeted unfairly, that she had proven her strength and should be left in peace. Others claimed the fire was a warning, a sign that she had pushed too far, taken too much. The sheriff came out to see the damage, but his words offered little comfort. "You're strong," he told her, "but strength draws enemies. Be careful." She nodded, though she already knew there was no careful path left. Days later, she saw him again near the creek. He stood on the bank, staring at the water as though it carried answers. She rode up slow, her horse's hooves soft on the soil. He didn't turn when she stopped, but his voice carried low. "You think this is yours? But this land doesn't forget, and neither do I." She studied him, the wear in his clothes, the hollowness in his eyes. He looked like a man clinging to ghosts, and yet the danger in him was real. "The land chose who stayed," she said quietly. "And you left." At that, he finally turned, his expression carved hard as stone. "I'll take back what should never have been yours." The days that followed moved like a drumbeat, each one louder than the last. Rumors swelled that he and his allies planned to challenge her outright, not with quiet sabotage or sly words, but with force. Her ranch hands braced for it, tightening their patrols, watching every shadow. She rode the boundaries herself, scanning the hills for signs of intrusion. The valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting. At the same time, smaller troubles piled higher. A shipment of supplies she had ordered never reached her, the wagon found overturned miles from the road. 2 of her horses vanished from the north pasture, tracks leading toward town, but vanishing before they reached it. And then came the most dangerous blow, a letter, delivered not by hand but slipped under her door in the night. The words were few, scrawled rough, but they chilled her. "This land will bleed again." She didn't show the letter to her workers, though the foreman guessed from the tightness in her jaw that something new had stirred. She wouldn't let fear rule them, wouldn't let panic poison the ranch. Still, she kept her rifle closer that night. Her eyes opened long after the lantern burned low. Meanwhile, the town itself became a stage for their conflict. People took sides, some quietly, some boldly. At the church gathering one Sunday, she felt eyes burn into her back, the weight of judgment heavy even in prayer. At the general store, a rancher's wife muttered loud enough for her to hear, "It's not right for a woman to hold so much power." Yet others stopped her on the street to whisper encouragement, their voices quick, as if afraid to be overheard. The division cut through friendships, through families, through every part of the community. He thrived on it, moving through town with a confidence that fed on the strife he created. He carried himself like a man reclaiming what was owed, his allies at his side, their gazes sharp and watchful. He wanted her to feel surrounded, wanted her to know she was not untouchable after all. And though she never bowed her head, she felt the walls closing in. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she gathered her hands in the yard. They stood in a circle, faces lit by lantern light, eyes steady on her. She told them plain what she believed, that their ranch was under threat, that the fight was no longer rumor, but fact. She promised them she would not bend, not surrender, not give up 1 inch of what they had built together. They answered with a silence heavy and sure, the kind of silence that meant loyalty stronger than words. Still, she could not escape the memories he stirred. Sometimes when the night stretched long and the wind rattled the windows, she thought of the man he once was, the laughter they had shared before it soured, the dreams they once painted together. But those thoughts never softened her heart. Instead, they sharpened her resolve, because they reminded her of what she had survived. The tension crept higher with each passing day. Horses shied at unseen movements, cattle lowed uneasy in the pastures, and even the children in town sensed the storm gathering. The sheriff tried again to calm both sides, but his words fell flat. The conflict had grown too large, too personal, too tied to pride and power. The valley seemed ready to erupt. The breaking point came with the rodeo, the yearly gathering that brought ranchers and townsfolk together in competition and celebration. This year, the event carried a different weight. Everyone knew she would be there, and everyone knew he would too. The rodeo grounds became more than a place of sport. It became the arena where their rivalry would be tested in plain sight. She rode in with her finest horse, the animal's coat shining under the sun, its strength a mirror of her own. The crowd watched with hushed awe, admiration mixing with tension. He arrived moments later, his entrance bold, as though he meant to claim the ground itself. Their eyes met across the arena, and for a moment the noise of the crowd faded into silence. It was not just a contest of skill now, it was a battle of presence, of who commanded the respect of the land and the people. Event after event unfolded, the crowd roaring, but beneath it all the true contest simmered. Every move, every glance between them tightened the rope already straining between their wills. By the time the final ride was called, the air was thick with expectation. The crowd leaned forward, eager, nervous, knowing they were watching more than a show. They were watching the beginning of a reckoning, as she mounted her horse for the last event. The sun dropped low, casting long shadows across the dirt. He mounted, too, his face set with grim determination. Two figures, once bound by love, and now divided by pride, prepared to clash under the gaze of the entire valley. The moment felt stretched, fragile, as if one spark could set the whole world ablaze. The climax was close. So close that the land itself seemed to tremble beneath them. And though no one yet knew how it would end, everyone understood one truth: the West was about to choose who it would remember. The crowd at the rodeo grounds leaned in as the final ride began. The sun sinking low, painting the dirt arena in firelight. She sat tall in the saddle, her horse restless beneath her, every muscle alive with power. Across the ring, he gripped the reins of his own mount, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Figures frozen in time, a lifetime of conflict balanced on the edge of this moment. Then the signal was given, and they launched forward, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground. It was more than a contest of skill. Every turn, every leap of the horse, every flick of the reins carried the weight of all that had come before. She rode with a calm fierceness, the steady strength of someone who had earned her place on the land with sweat and grit. He rode with desperate energy, his movements sharp, urgent, as though this ride might win him back not just the crowd but the power he had lost. The crowd roared, dust rising, children on the fences clutching tight as the two riders moved in a dance that was half rivalry, half destiny. When it ended, there was no mistaking it. Her horse stood steady, breathing hard but proud, while his mount frothed and stumbled under the strain of his heavy hand. The judges didn't need to say it aloud, though they did, raising their hands in her favor as the cheers of the crowd erupted. She had won not just the ride, but the unspoken battle that had been simmering all season. He lowered his head, shoulders heavy, the defeat plain. The rodeo had chosen, and so had the town. But even then, victory didn't bring her gloating or loud triumph. She sat in the saddle, quiet, her face calm, her eyes meeting his across the dust. There was no smile, no mockery, only truth. He had come back to prove himself, to take what he believed was his. Instead, he had been forced to see what she had become, stronger, wilder, untouchable, and the land itself had sided with her. After the rodeo, the town buzzed with talk, but the tide had turned. Those who once whispered doubts now spoke openly of her strength, their admiration clear. The ranchers who had stood with him slipped away, their alliance crumbling under the weight of his defeat. Even those who envied her success knew now that she was a force they couldn't break. She walked through town with her head high, not needing to speak a word. Respect was carved in the air around her, undeniable. For him, there was no place left to stand. The sheriff spoke with him quietly after telling him plain that any further claims or fights would not be tolerated. The law in the West was thin, but even thin law had teeth when the people demanded it. He lingered a few days more, haunting the edges of town, but the look in his eyes told everyone that he knew the truth. The land had made its choice, and it had not chosen him. Back on the ranch, life slowly steadied again. The fences were mended, the barns repaired, the cattle grazing fat in the pastures. Her workers moved with renewed pride, knowing they had stood firm through the storm. The young hand who had once feared the whispers now carried himself taller, his loyalty deepened by the trials they had weathered. And the rancher's daughter, eager and sharp, became a regular presence. Learning the ropes, her eyes bright with the possibility of one day carving her own path. The ranch wasn't just surviving, it was planting seeds for the future. Yet the memory of what had happened lingered. She often walked the creek at dusk, listening to the water's steady flow, remembering the threats, the fear, the way the land had been tested. She thought of the letter that promised blood, of the fire that nearly swallowed her barn, of the weight of every choice. And she thought of him, the man who once shared her dreams but had chosen mockery instead of belief. His return had stirred the past, but it had also put it to rest. She no longer carried the sting of his betrayal. Now, it was only a scar proof that she had been broken and had risen anyway. The key takeaway wasn't her wealth or her triumph, though both were plain. It was the truth that the West only rewarded those willing to stand unshaken. The land demanded everything: sweat, blood, patience, and gave nothing freely. But for those who endured, who refused to bend, the land gave back something no man could take: respect. He rode out of town one morning with no fanfare, no goodbye. A few watched from the boardwalk as he disappeared into the horizon, but no one followed. His shadow faded across the plains, swallowed by the same dust he had once left her in. She watched from a distance, her heart steady. There was no anger left, only certainty. Whatever his future held, it would never again touch hers. As autumn settled over the valley, the ranch thrived in ways she had once only dreamed. The fields were full, the livestock strong, the people bound together by loyalty and pride. When travelers passed through, they spoke of her ranch as a place of legend, of a woman who had turned broken ground into fortune, who had faced down her past and come out stronger. Her story carried farther than the fences, farther than the creek, carried by the wind across towns and settlements. On quiet nights, she sat on her porch, watching the stars wheel across the wide sky. The ranch stretched out before her, not just a patch of land, but a kingdom of her own making. She thought of the girl she once was, standing in the dust with nothing but debt and mockery at her back. That girl had almost given up, but she hadn't. And now the land bore witness to her triumph. She knew challenges would come again. Droughts, storms, rivalries. The West never let anyone rest easy, but she no longer feared them. She had faced worse and endured. The ranch wasn't just a piece of property, it was proof. Proof that strength was forged in fire, that failure could be turned to triumph, that no voice of doubt could define her unless she allowed it. As the night deepened and the crickets sang, she leaned back in her chair, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. The story was finished, not with vengeance or bitterness, but with peace. He had mocked her once, called her broken, but now he was gone, and she remained, richer, wilder, untouchable. The land had chosen, and it had chosen her. And in the stillness of the wide American West, that truth would echo long after both of them were gone, carried on the wind like every story worth remembering, top of form, bottom of form,